Okay, everyone. Hello. I'm Tyler Chrestman. Welcome to the Chrestman Conversation. It is the holidays. We just had Christmas yesterday. Happy belated Christmas to everyone. And it's Boxing Day today, the 26th of December. Since the news has taken a siesta, they're also on holiday break. We're going to do a little bit different of an episode today. So I recently had a talk with somebody about the pagan origins of Christmas, and the idea for this episode sort of was born. So on the episode today, we're going to take a look at the myth that Christmas is derived from pagan traditions, and we're going to debunk some of that today. And I want to start with we're going to make this kind of fast. I don't want this to be a long video. I want this to be something pithy where we can kind of go through it quickly and do a little debunking. So, let's start with the date. The claim is that Christmas is on December 25th because it's actually borrowed from pagan festivals such as Sol Invictus or Saturnalia. When you look at this independently, when you look at these claims independently, Sol Invictus was never celebrated on December 25th before the birth of Jesus. In fact, you won't find any record of it until the year 354 AD that the holiday even took place. And before the date of the holiday was established, it was earlier in the year. So Sol Invictus used to be anywhere between August and December. There's dates August 8th, 9th, 28th, October 11th, or December 11th. You have a lot of dates for this holiday. It was never December 25th. It was never even later in December until after the birth of Jesus, when the holiday was later moved to actually take from the Christians, not the other way around. When the pagan traditions sort of went out the window, they moved some holidays to December 25th to sort of glom on to the Christian holiday, not the other way around. So Sol Invictus was never celebrated on December 25th before Jesus was born. The same could be said of Saturnalia. So this is the one that's actually more interesting because it's a little closer to December 25th. There is a record from Macrobius Ambrosius Theodosis, that last name, or as his buddy called him, Macrobius. He recorded he's an ancient historian. He recorded an entire compendium on the topic of Saturnalia. So he said, we're talking the year 300 AD. Saturnalia typically began 14 days before January. The date moved many times. Sometimes it would be to more coincide with the astrological sign of Capricorn, which Capricorn is named after the house of Saturn, who obviously the Feast of Saturnalia is in honor of. So the date moved a lot. And it's important to remember that the Roman calendar had 2 extra days in December. So when we change the calendar, the dates get moved. But typically 14 days before January was not December 25th. The feast also never really overlapped December 25th, even though it went from 3 to 5 to 7 days. Eventually went back down to 3 and then wound up on 5 days. But the one thing that is sure is that Saturnalia never overlapped with December 25th. The feast to honor Saturn didn't resemble any Christian or Christmas practices that happened around the time or modern practices. None of them, there's no overlap either in date or practice here that makes Saturnalia a obvious step for Christians. They didn't co-opt it from that feast. It had nothing to do with one or the other. So when you look at it and you say, well, the fact that these pagan holidays were around the same time, it makes sense that obviously Christians just stole the date. Where would it come from otherwise? And the reality is that early Christians just really believed that Jesus was born on that day. You have a lot of contemporary evidence that this is what they actually believed. So, for example, in the 3rd century, you have a historian named Sextus Julius Africanus, who wrote this basically chronological compendium of the history of the world. That's what he was trying to do. He was trying to basically outline the history of the world. And when he was going back over the history of the entire world, he tried to use the Gospels to count backwards and conclude that Jesus was born on March 25th. This is what he concluded based on his accounting of the Gospels. He then counted ahead 9 months from March 25th and came up with the birth of Jesus in December 25th. He said, look, this is obviously where Jesus was born. around the same time that he was doing that, you had another man, Hippolytus of Rome, who wrote a book and concluded that Jesus was born 8 days before the calends of January. So the beginning of January, he said 8 days before that is when Jesus was born. Now, again, we have to adjust for the modern calendar here, but that would mean that Jesus was born on either December 24th or 25th, depending on how you do the math there. But yes, around December 25th. And then there was this other popular idea with early Christians who used to believe that if you were holy, you would die on the day you were born or the day you were conceived. The more holy a person, the more cyclic their life was. So this belief was pretty prevalent in Christianity 1,000 years ago. And so the idea comes from the fact that in the Old Testament, when you're reading the Old Testament, you have a bunch of people. It basically gives a life account of many people, and they're always rounded. They don't give, oh, he was born on this day, this month, this year. It's mostly just years. He was born here, he was born here. So it had this very flat, rounded numbers. And so they believed that holy people in the Bible used to die on the day they were born or conceived. So you would say, all right, Jesus was the holiest of holies. He's as perfect as they come. So obviously he would die on the day he was conceived because his life was a cycle and the cycle was perfect. So he died and on the day he was conceived. So how did you come to that number? Well, in the year 200 or around the year 200, you had this guy, Tertullian, who wrote that Jesus went through the Passion in the month of March during Passover, 8 days before the start of April. Again, we adjust the calendar for modern times, and that would mean that Jesus died on March 25th. Count ahead 9 months, you have December 25th. 100 years later, Augustine wrote the same thing. He said that there was an ongoing belief that Jesus died on March 25th and that his birth was on December 25th. Now, you're talking a couple hundred years after Jesus was dead. Not a couple thousand years, but these guys are relatively contemporary accounts of what they believed at the time. So you're looking at the death of Jesus and basically 100 years later, 200 years later, they were writing about these accounts of what happened. So this is the equivalent of us talking about Abraham Lincoln. We know when Abraham Lincoln was born. We know when Abraham Lincoln died. That's what they're talking about. That's what it is. That's how far removed we are. We kind of have an idea better about Abraham Lincoln. Now, in 10,000 years, you're going to look back and they're going to rely on us to have told them when Abraham Lincoln was born and died, because they're going to have no idea, because they're going to have to base it on contemporaneous accounts. That's what we're doing. We're saying, hey, these guys who existed maybe a couple hundred years after Jesus, a little bit less in Tertullian's case, they said Jesus died on March 25th. That means, and then 9 months later, and he died on the day he was conceived. Now, we don't know that, but they're saying that was the belief. That they know he died on March 25th, and that at the time they believed he was born on December 25th. So it's not as though in the last 1,000 years we've done something different. This is, again, before really Christianity was prevalent throughout the world. So there were still a lot of pagans in the year 200. All right, we're not talking about a Christianity that is a world dominant power. We're talking about a Christianity that's still on the rise. These guys are not the dominant force in the world at the time. So anyway, that is where the date comes from. It's not stolen from pagans. It's not anything to do that. There are some other traditions that also are kind of interesting that people say, oh, these could be pagan in origin or based on this or that. For example, Santa Claus, what does he have to do with Christianity? What does he have to do with Christmas? Why is he? So Santa, as many people would say, is based on a real person. There's a feast that's been celebrated in his name, St. Nicholas, for centuries. The modern conception of Santa Claus, though, this idea of the fat guy with the big red suit, that is a relatively modern thing. It doesn't come from any pagan traditions. It comes from the Dutch. The Dutch settlers in New York. There was a bunch of immigrants who came to New York who had this idea in their head. The Dutch but the Dutch celebrated something called Sinterklaas. It's Sinterklaas. Sinterklaas was actually a Catholic priest, but he got a rebrand basically in the 1800s that dressed him up in traditional Dutch clothing, which was a big red suit. So these traditional Dutch clothings took a Catholic priest who the Dutch used to celebrate, and they transformed him into this personification of Saint Nicholas and gave him the big red suit in the sort of modern way that we think about Santa Claus. It wasn't just some pagan person who was adopted. Now, there is a pagan practice which kind of was adopted in the hanging of stockings. There's a pagan deity that was sort of, they took this tradition of the stockings. Again, this is a modern conception. This is not something that goes back 100 years, but there was, I'm sorry, this something only goes back about 100 years. It's not something that goes back centuries. They basically took the idea of the stocking and gave the idea of the stocking to the modern personification of Saint Nicholas, but it wasn't so much taking from the pagan as the pagan tradition sort of morphing into a more Christian tradition. It really didn't have much to do with itself. It basically did not borrow heavily from any pagan traditions, the idea of St. Nicholas. The stocking thing is the only thing I really saw that you could really make an argument that, well, they used to do this in a pagan tradition, but there's almost no overlap. And it really comes actually, let me look at my little note here. So that actually comes, I can't remember the name off the top of my head of the pagan deity. I had it written down, and I totally am blanking on it right now. So the pagan deity, what was the name of that thing? Excuse me. So, okay, there it is. Oh, that's why I couldn't remember it. So it's Julupuki, which is an old pagan deity. But they took this thing and basically took the tradition of hanging the stockings from this Julupuki, whatever. So the pronunciation of my pagan deities is a little lacking. And they took that and did give it to Santa Claus. But again, not really a morphing of a pagan deity into Santa Claus. Santa Claus already existed. They just took the stocking. So anyway, there was actually something that predated this modern idea of Santa Claus that came with the Dutch. And it was something that Father Christmas. And Father Christmas was the physical embodiment of the Christmas spirit. And that is an old, ancient tradition. We know it goes back to before the year 1450, because we know this because it was already talked about widespread in 1450, and there were carols written about Father Christmas. And Father Christmas at the time, so in 1450, there was a man named Richard Smart of Plymtree who wrote a carol about the coming of Father Christmas. Father Christmas shows up, he announces, hey, I'm Christmas personified, and then he announces the birth of Jesus Christ. That's what Father Christmas does. Back in the 1400s. So Father Christmas was older than St. Nicholas. He was older than the idea of Santa Claus. And what you see is that Father Christmas and Santa Claus actually sort of morph into this one idea where you have a Catholic priest and someone who comes around to embody Christmas and announce the birth of Jesus, morph into this one thing that we now call Santa Claus. So Santa Claus is not pagan. He's not based on pagan traditions. He's based on Father Christmas and a bunch of Dutch immigrants who celebrated a Catholic priest named Santa Claus. So anyway, not pagan at all. The Christmas tree. This is a big one because I hear people all the time talk about this one. This was actually a sticking point for me in my conversation about the pagan origins of Christmas. Christmas trees are not pagan. We are told that the pagans used to worship the pine tree, or that the star has 5 points because it's a pagan symbol. And this is not true. It's not why we have a star on top of the tree. It's not where the tree comes from. Pagans, they were told they used to bring trees into their home to guard against nature. Maybe somewhat true. But the Christmas tree itself it only goes back to the 16th century in Europe. Pagans didn't think pine trees were special. They didn't. There were certain Germanic tribes that thought oak trees were special or holy. But again, they had nothing to do with pine trees, and the pagans didn't used to bring pine trees into their house. This was not a thing. There are a couple different origins of the idea of the Christmas tree. Martin Luther is one of them, for example. They say Martin Luther was strolling through the woods during winter, and he was just sort of overtaken by the beauty of nature, the brilliance of the stars, and how godly everything was. And so he cut down the Christmas tree and brought it home. And then to try and recreate the moment in his house, put a star on top of the tree for the stars in the sky, decorated the tree, and did all this. And basically they used to put actually candles in the tree. The same deal is because it was representing God's glorious work of the heavens, not a pagan tradition. None of that is based on a pagan tradition. The pagans didn't used to put the stars on top of the trees. They didn't used to light trees. They didn't bring pine trees into the house. None of this possibly started with Martin Luther. Another possible origin is that it used to be common practice to do something called a paradise tree, where you would bring a tree into the house and you would decorate it with fruit to represent the Garden of Eden, the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. You used to do this to celebrate God, and then it's possible that got co-opted into the tradition of decorating the Christmas tree. It's just one possible thing. Another possible origin is that Saint Boniface, he cut down an oak tree. So it used to be, as we said, there were certain Germanic tribes that thought oak trees were holy. He cut down an oak tree that had been dedicated to Thor, and he cut down the tree and then was not struck dead by lightning and said, your God doesn't, what does he do? And he then looked at a pine tree and said basically that the pine tree was dedicated for Christ, and that if oak was going to be for some pagan gods or some Norse deity, then he was going to dedicate the pine tree to Christ. And so it became tradition to then decorate the tree for Christ. It could be, we don't really know the origin of it, but one of those stories, or possibly a combination of all three of those stories, is more of an origin, because we do know that there's no evidence that says that pagans used to do any of this. They didn't used to decorate the trees. They didn't bring trees in the house. They didn't put stars on the trees. They didn't put candles on the branch. None of this stuff is a pagan practice. None of it. So it didn't come from pagan tradition, which is the point. Anyway, the same could be said for mistletoe. There was some talk that mistletoe was the same kind of deal. Pagans didn't use mistletoe. They didn't decorate with it for the holidays. Christians have been decorating with it since the 1600s. So it's a long time. The modern tradition of kissing underneath the mistletoe didn't start until the 18th century in Britain. Again, not a pagan practice. It's a relatively modern practice, not taken from any other religion. The interesting thing about this is that you hear this all the time, but yet there's no evidence that any of this stuff was stolen from other religions or other practices. And there is other evidence that says that other religions stole these practices for their own. They actually co-opted the Christian traditions as their own, not the other way around. It's kind of an interesting thing. Anyway, I wanted to make just this quick video for some of my people out there to know that you have the ability. You can celebrate Christmas however you want. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention. Christmas trees. I saw some interesting stuff here that I didn't realize people believe this, but there's a verse in Jeremiah in the Bible that basically talks about cutting down a tree and decorating it and says this is bad. You're not allowed to do it. And there's some people who have taken this to say that you cannot have a Christmas tree, that a Christmas tree is anti-Bible. Guys, you are misreading that passage. Let me just tell you that is not what they're talking about in Jeremiah. Sometimes we have to take the things that the Bible says and we have to try and contextualize them. We have to try and use our reason to figure out what they mean. They're saying words, and the words have a meaning. They meant something when they wrote it. I'm not talking about a modern interpretation. I'm not talking about taking it and twisting it and trying to figure out what I can use to justify my beliefs. I'm saying we have to try and figure out what they believed. And what they believed, or what they are talking about in Jeremiah when they talk about the cutting down of a tree, they are talking about a person who is cutting down a tree, working the wood, decorating the wood, and worshiping a false idol. That is not what a Christmas tree is. A Christmas tree is not an idol. You are not worshiping the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree is fun. The Christmas tree is actually, if you're taking the Boniface approach, the Christmas tree is a dedication to Christ. It's not a false idol. You're not worshiping the tree. And that's not what they were talking about. They're not just talking about putting tinsel on a tree and saying, isn't that pretty? That's not what that passage is about. That passage is about somebody who is creating an idol and worshiping it, which is obviously something you're not supposed to do. That's the second commandment. Let's not do that. It's a bad thing. Anyway, Anyway, people, quick video, but I just thought it'd be fun to go over some things, and that way I can send this to a friend of mine. Oh, by the way, I wanted to say, there was a 3 years ago, I found this infographic that was really helpful. It was just a quick guide to most of the information that I said in here, and I thought it was really great. I said, "Oh, this is great," because I always would try and defend it, say this is not really a pagan practice, but it was a really quick reference guide for me to have to be able to just articulate those thoughts. And so when I was getting ready to put this video out, I looked at it and I said, "Okay, oh, it's got a name on here," and I realized that the guy, I didn't realize it was him who put the infographic out. His name is Wes Huff, and he's got a video that is great. That is basically this, but even better. He's better than me at this. He's more knowledgeable than me on this topic. If you are really interested in this and you want a big deep dive, go check out Wes Huff. He's got a video. I pulled it up here. It's called "Christmas Isn't Pagan and Here's Why." Great video. And as I put this together, and I start looking at the infographic and realize, oh, this guy is the guy. And I knew him from some other things. I didn't realize he had made the infographic. And so I pulled up the video and I started looking through it. I said, oh, okay, great. This is a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about. He's awesome. Go check him out. Wes Huff. Where most of the information in here comes from an infographic that he made years ago that he talks about on the thing. It's a great video. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you guys had a wonderful Christmas. I really do. And we'll see you guys next week. As always, questions, comments, concerns, leave them down below. If you got anything you want me to talk about on the show, I will try and put it on the list if it's an interesting or fun topic. Anyway, Merry Christmas, and I'll see you guys in a week.